Chapter 4: Life in the American Colonies.
The story matters. At first glance, the painting is simple, just a woman and her small baby. Look deeper, however, and you can see more. The portrait dates from the 1670s, just 50 years after the Pilgrims first arrived in New England. It shows Elizabeth Freak, wife of a Boston merchant, and lawyer John Freak with baby Mary. Notice the fine fabrics mother and child are wearing. For many colonial Americans, such as the Freaks, life is no longer a struggle for survival. In fact, it is increasingly prosperous and comfortable. Lesson 1: Colonial Economy. It matters because the unique resources and conditions that existed in each colony helped shape colonial economies and ways of living. Making a living in the colonies. Guiding question: how did the economic activity of the three regions reflect their geography? Life in colonial America was based largely on agriculture. Most colonists farmed or made their livings from businesses related to farming, such as milling flour. Geography played an important role in the colony's economic development. Colonists learned to adapt to the climate and terrain of the region where they lived. Commercial New England. In New England, long winters and thin, rocky soil made large-scale farming difficult. Most farmers here practiced subsistence farming, producing enough to meet the needs of their families with little left over to sell or trade. New England farmers often depended on their children for labor. Everyone in the family worked, spinning yarn, milking cows, fencing fields, and sowing and harvesting crops. Women made cloth, garments, candles, and soaps for their families. Throughout New England were many small businesses. Nearly every town had a mill for grinding grain or sawing lumber. People used water power from streams to run the mills. Large towns attracted skilled craftspeople. Among them were blacksmiths, shoemakers, furniture makers, and gunsmiths. Shipbuilding was an important New England industry. The lumber for building ships came from the region's forests. Workers floated the lumber down rivers to shipyards in coastal towns. The northern coastal cities served as centers of the colonial shipping trade, linking the northern colonies with the southern colonies and America with other parts of the world. Fishing was also important. Some New Englanders ventured far out to sea to hunt whales for oil and whalebone. The Middle Colonies. Most people in the Middle Colonies were farmers. This region enjoyed more fertile soil and a slightly milder climate than New England. Farmers here plowed and planted larger areas of land and produced bigger harvests than did New Englanders. In New York and Pennsylvania, farmers grew large quantities of wheat and other cash crops, crops that could be sold easily in markets in the colonies and overseas. Farmers sent wheat and livestock for shipment to New York City and Philadelphia, which became busy ports. By 1760, New York, with 14,000 people, and Philadelphia, with 19,000 people, were two of the largest cities in the American colonies. Like the New England colonies, the Middle colonies also had industries. Some were home-based crafts, such as carpentry and flower making. Others were larger businesses, lumber mills, mines, ironworks, small-scale manufacturing, and so on. The Middle colonies attracted many Scotch-Irish, German, Dutch, and Swedish settlers. Using agricultural methods developed in Europe, these immigrants became successful farmers. They gave the Middle colonies a cultural diversity or variety not found in New England. Life in the southern colonies. The southern colonies had rich soil and a warm climate well suited to certain kinds of farming. Southern farmers could plant large areas and produce harvests of cash crops such as tobacco or rice. Most settlers in the southern colonies made their living from farming. Little commerce or industry developed there. For the most part, London merchants rather than local merchants from the colonies managed southern trade. Most large plantations were located in the Tidewater, a region of flat, low-lying plains along the seacoast. Planters built their plantations on rivers so they could ship their crops to market by boat. A plantation was like a small village. It had fields stretching out around a cluster of buildings, including cabins, barns, and stables, as well as carpenter and blacksmith shops, storerooms, and kitchens. A large plantation might have its own chapel and school. Small plantations often had fewer than 50 enslaved workers. Large ones typically had 200 or more. Between the Tidewater and the Appalachian Mountains lay a region of hills and forests known as the Backcountry. Its settlers included hardy newcomers to the colonies. They grew corn and tobacco on small family farms. Some had 1 or 2 enslaved Africans to help with the work. Backcountry farmers greatly outnumbered large plantation owners. Still, the plantation owners were wealthier and more powerful. They controlled the economic and political life of the region. Tobacco and rice. Tobacco was the principal cash crop in Maryland and Virginia. Growing tobacco and preparing it for sale required a lot of labor. At first, planters used indentured servants to work in the fields. These servants worked for a time and then went free. When indentured servants became scarce and expensive, Southern planters began using enslaved Africans instead. Slaveholders with large farms grew wealthy by growing tobacco. They sold most of it in Europe. Sometimes, though, there was too much tobacco on the market, more than buyers wanted. To sell the extra tobacco, planters had to lower their prices. As a result, their profits fell. Some planters switched to other crops, such as corn and wheat. The geography of South Carolina and Georgia helped make rice the main cash crop there. In low-lying areas along the coast, planters built dams to create rice fields called paddies. Planters flooded the fields when the rice was young and drained them when the rice was ready to harvest. Work in the rice paddies was very hard. It involved standing knee-deep in the mud with no protection from the blazing sun or biting insects. To do this hard work, rice growers relied on slave labor. Rice proved to be an even more profitable crop than tobacco. Prices rose steadily as rice became popular in Europe. By the 1750s, South Carolina and Georgia had the fastest growing economies in the colonies. The growth of slavery. Guiding question: why were enslaved Africans brought to the colonies? By the time Europeans were sailing to the Americas, slavery was widely practiced in West Africa. Many West African kingdoms enslaved those they defeated in war. Slave traders from Arab lands bought some of these enslaved people. Others were forced to work in gold mines or farm fields. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas created a huge new demand for enslaved workers. Colonists needed a large labor force to work on their plantations. West African slave traders met this need. They sold captives they gained through wars and raids. Slavery and the slave trade became major parts of the colonial economy. For enslaved Africans, the voyage to America usually began with a march to a European fort on the West African coast. There they were sold to Europeans who loaded them on ships. The Middle Passage. The trip across the ocean was called the Middle Passage. This name came from the fact that it was often the second or middle leg of the three-part route known as the triangular trade. People called this route triangular because as the ships traveled between their destinations, their paths formed the three sides of a triangle. The Middle Passage was a terrible ordeal. Chained together for more than a month, prisoners could hardly sit or stand. They received little food or water. Africans who died or became sick were thrown overboard. Those who refused to eat were whipped. Those who survived the Middle Passage faced another terror when they reached American ports, the slave market. There they were put up for sale as laborers to plantation owners. The life of the slave. Some enslaved Africans on plantations did housework, but most worked in the fields. Many enslaved workers suffered great cruelty. Owners of large plantations hired overseers or bosses to keep the enslaved Africans working hard. Many colonies had slave codes, rules governing the behavior and punishment of enslaved people. Some did not allow enslaved workers to leave the plantation without the slaveholder's written permission. Some made it illegal to teach enslaved people to read or write. Enslaved people were seldom allowed to move about freely or gather in large groups. Punishments ranged from whipping for even minor misdeeds to hanging or burning to death for more serious crimes. Enslaved workers who ran away were punished severely when caught. Although enslaved Africans had strong family ties, their families were often torn apart when a slaveholder sold a spouse, parent, or child. Many of the enslaved found strength in their African roots. They developed a culture that drew on the languages, customs, and religions of their African homelands. Some enslaved Africans learned trades such as carpentry, blacksmithing, or weaving. Skilled workers could sometimes set up shops, sharing their profits with the slaveholders. Those lucky enough to be able to buy their freedom joined the small population of free African Americans. Critics of slavery. Not all colonists believed in slavery. Many Puritans, for example, refused to hold enslaved people. In Pennsylvania, Quakers and Mennonites condemned slavery. Eventually, the debate over slavery would spark a bloody war between North and South. Progress check. Describing. What role did Africans play in the economy of the Southern colonies?
Africans played a big role in the economy of the southern colonies because they were the hard labor. They were free. The plantation owners only had to make sure that they were fed. They would work from dusk, from dawn to dusk, tending the fields, tending to the plantation owners, tending to their families, and all of it was basically just for scraps. And they were not treated well. They did not live in nice houses. It was a bare existence.